Good morning, everybody.
Morning.
Morning. How's everybody today? All good? Okay. Wonderful. Yeah, great. Fabulous. Fabulous. It's a nice day. Fabulous. Okay. Thank you for coming. We're going to start today's great discussion. First, before we start, I welcome everybody to today's webinar and event. And I'm Bruce Singer, and just share who I am. I am CEO and president of Bizon Capital Corporation, which has a couple of businesses, one of which supplies chief financial officers to clients on a part-time basis and contract basis. And today I'm pleased to have my guest, and we've become great friends, Deborah Nixon. And Deborah, before we start, can you just tell us a bit about yourself, and then we'll get into today's panel discussion.
Hey, thanks for having me. And it's so great to see all of my colleagues on here. So thanks everyone who knows me for coming. So I'm with Mandrake, and also what I do is executive coaching. I do executive search. I've been doing this for quite a long time. Before I rejoined Mandrake in 2015, I had a consulting business and organizational transformation, HR consulting for 25 years. And I came back to Mandrake, who I worked for in the late 80s, to run the leadership group. And, you know, Bruce and I were talking about this, and part of the reason we're talking about virtual leadership is once the pandemic hit, as everybody else, you know, we were all confined to home. And I've been working a lot with executives over the last 3 months on how do you manage virtually. I have also been doing a lot of executive onboarding virtually. So from interview to hire to joining the organization, in many cases, these executives have not actually met anybody in person. And so the onboarding process and the connecting process is really, really different in a virtual world.
Super. Okay, so thank you, Deborah. So we're going to start the discussion, and also encourage everybody to chime in. Everybody's video's on, and if you're not connected to video or audio already, please feel free to join in. We want today's discussion to be very interactive, getting away, I call it, from the boring Q&A program. You know what I mean? Frankly, I'm bored of Q&As, so let's make it interactive. And I just want to start the discussion by saying, so Deborah, how can one be a great virtual leader? Talk about that. What's a great virtual leader?
Yeah, so, you know, leadership in a virtual world isn't quite the same as leadership when you're able to be in the same room with the person. So, you know, I can share the experience of the leaders who are onboarding virtually. And one of the things that you really have to adjust to is you don't have the nuanced connections and conversations and the spontaneity that you would have if you're all working physically in the same place. So think about how so many of your relationships are formed. They're formed in the moment, they're formed in the spontaneous interaction, the dropping by the office, the meeting in the kitchen. So your relationships and your communication happen in little bits and pieces. And in a virtual world, all of your connections and your communication have to be very intentional. And so with the intentionality, sometimes you lose that spontaneity. The other thing that I've noticed, and all of you notice this with all the Zooming that we're doing, some people are much more comfortable on Zoom than others. So I can tell when I run my webinars, and we can see today, like a lot of people aren't on camera. So think about, I equate it this way, that when you come to a virtual meeting and you don't go on camera, it's as if you're invited to a meeting in the physical world and you stay outside the room and you call in. Right? So when, you know, it's really important when you're on a Zoom and you're getting together with people that you turn that camera on, because who knows what's going on behind. Thank you for those who've come on.
You made a very good point.
Who knows what's going on behind that black screen? Like, are you even there? Right? So it's really hard for the person who's leading the meeting or trying to speak to you to kind of look at just the name and think, are they there? Are they not there? Like, what are they doing? And I get it with the technical problems. So imagine all of that. The other thing that we're noticing is, you know, the whole piece around technology. So you try to have a conversation, you know, your technology isn't working, or people don't even know how to run the technology. So there's some issues around virtual leadership. And, you know, I can go through all the points about what it takes to be a really good virtual leader, but there are some real basics that people have to get comfortable with before they can even get into the whole leadership piece. The technology is important. The lighting is important. The ability for people to see is important. I've talked to people a lot about, and they've come to those sessions where we talk about how to do a Zoom meeting. For people in transition, we talk about how to do a Zoom interview. Things like where your laptop or your iPad are located, so people aren't looking up at your chin, or seeing things you don't want them to see. So there's lots of that piece. And I see Anne's point, and you're right, Anne, like the communication piece in a virtual environment is so important. And we talk about communication being important in leadership, but you know, in virtual leadership, it's all you have, right? Because it's very difficult to see body language. You know, there's a certain energy that you get when you're in a room with people. You can, you know, you've heard about reading the room, or reading the social signals. And that's really hard to do when all you see is this. It's very difficult to get that touch and feel. And so you have to be quite mindful of your communication virtually.
Interesting. You know, when you say mindful, so what is, can you go in deeper into mindful? Because that means different things to different people. Like can you expand on that a bit, Deb?
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah.
So you know, if you're not comfortable, virtually, then it'll be very difficult for you to communicate what you mean. Like, how do you communicate on Zoom your feelings of support, your feelings of encouragement? How do you have a difficult conversation on Zoom? You know, Zoom kind of takes us one level past. So you have to work really hard to try to bring yourself forward. I mean, one thing we're hearing about through COVID is the need to build community. And whether the community that you're building is the community within your work team or within your organization, people are really, really hungering for connection. And so how do you build that connection? So before you know, what I've noticed with a lot of leaders, I'll give you an example. I onboarded a new leader, and she's got a team. And I said to her the second week, so when did you have your meeting with your team? Oh, well, a week ago. You know, that might be okay if you're in a regular workplace, because you're seeing your team throughout the day. You're probably popping by, you're probably saying, hey, how's your day? How was your weekend? But in a virtual environment, if you haven't met your team for a week, that means you've had zero communication with, like, nothing. So to be mindful means to think about that fact that if you haven't met with your team in a week, they have heard nothing from you, maybe some emails, which will probably be instructional. Do this, do that, give me feedback. But if you're trying to build relationships, you have to be very intentional when you're virtual. So you have to probably be having your Zoom meetings or phone conversations, because people are tired of Zoom, but you need to be checking in a couple of times a week. But you have to get to that balance as well, because I've also heard the other side, which is, oh my God, I'm so sick of my leader calling me, asking me how I am. I'm fine. So, you know, you've got to, you know, we're all feeling our way through this. But authenticity is really important. And that's really tough for people who have a more formal leadership style, right? It's how do you express your emotion, and how do you get your feelings and your intentions across in this environment? So I tell people to try to dial back the typical formality of their meetings, because if you try to run a virtual meeting in the same way that you run an in-person meeting, it'll become really stilted, it'll become really stiff, and it'll become very formal, and people won't share. So you need to first adjust your own style, and you need to encourage your team to communicate with you and to tell them that it's okay. They don't need to be formal either. So I know that a lot of people have meetings and they like to put agendas together, and that's a really great idea. You should not have meetings that go off track. But in a virtual world, you shouldn't be setting up a meeting to say, hello, everybody, here we are, good to see you. Okay, point one, here's what's on the agenda. Point two, here's what's on the agenda. I really think that it's important for you to take a more casual approach. So for example, you can start your meeting and say, hey, really great to see you all. Why don't we take a couple of minutes and just go around? Everybody can kind of check in, tell us what's happening in your life, tell us what's going on. And so maybe that takes you an extra 10 or 15 minutes, but it's really important to rush that part. And then you can say to people, listen, we have a lot of stuff going on in the organization. We've got a few pieces on the agenda. So why don't we get started? But hey, everybody, jump in if you have something to say, use the chat box so we can control the flow of conversation. But you don't want to be the leader that runs the meeting so that you become a talking head and everybody just passively sits and listens to you, which is probably what happens very often in a real world environment, right? We all know what that's like. The big cheese walks in the room and everybody kind of quiets and waits for him and her to take the lead. And in these virtual environment, you want to change that up a bit.
So let's take an example. You have a good example right now. Let's change it up a bit, okay? In our meeting right now, because you're doing a talking. I'm not saying it's bad, by the way. Look, we're all learning. This is the new norm, right? Yep. How would anybody else like to start and share an experience, and click off your audio, and share what are some of the challenges you have, or just talk about how's your day, just something. Anybody want to? I'm calling for a voluntold.
I'm going to look at the chat.
Volunteer. Tina.
Oh, hi.
Hi, Tina. How you doing?
Thank you. Thank you for inviting me to be the first speaker. Okay, so I'm Tina Shinelli.
You got voluntold. Tell us about yourself. Tell us about yourself.
Well, I've been in the workforce for over 30 years, specializing in HR. Most of my jobs, whether in operations or HR, I've noticed now have always focused on how do you make something better, how do you make the workplace better, and how do you develop people in the process. So I think that that's my niche, and that's really what I thrive in. Specific to this topic, which I find continues to be a challenge regardless of the company I'm at or the group that I'm working with, is how do you get managers to really change how they behave? So these are the ones that are more introverts, or the ones that are, like you said in this discussion earlier, the ones that really just get down to business. So how can you coach them? Like, we've sent them to coaching, we've done one-on-ones, we've put it on their scorecards, and they still struggle in this space. And that's the feedback that we get. So for me, it's a personal goal that I have, that I really want to make the people side of their business their key deliverable, as opposed to what they need to do. Because what they need to do always gets delivered, right? It's just like bills. If you have a loan, that always gets paid, but you don't. So I'm interested from this community and from this group, specifically on some strategies that you've done, or I know some cases are hopeless. Like sometimes you just have to say, you know what, this is as good as it's going to get. Yeah. So, we've scripted comments for some leaders, and sometimes I'm happy that they just follow that script. But I'm just interested from everyone here. I mean, it's a group of very senior professionals, and I really would value some, even just your thoughts and opinions. Thank you.
Anybody want to share on that?
I'm going to jump in, Tina. I think the challenge now is the lack of comfort for leaders. So if you weren't a great leader in terms of communicating before, it's even worse now that you are sitting there and possibly looking into people's homes. So for me, it's really about, focusing on the human and genuine side of it. So getting them to start a conversation more with, if my cat runs behind me or something, or, I'm working at home, you're working at home, how's that working for you? So get them to do like an icebreaker at the beginning, more personal. So talking about something personal about themselves, and then you bring that genuineness to the table. But also the scripting for them has to be very intentional. And that's something Deborah talks about a lot too. So are they calling for a weekly check-in? Fine. But the employee is going to realize after week 3 that there's no genuineness behind it. They're just being told to call me. So it needs to be intentional. They have to call with a reason. Why are you calling today? So the leader, if it's really a genuine check-in, that's fine. But get that leader to hold on to something, the reason why he's calling. I'm calling about well-being today. So how are you doing with your kids? And then it's a more genuine and intentional conversation. So
Thank you.
I really agree with that, and I think some leaders really struggle with that because we've all, of a certain generation, right? We've been trained to be very professional, to not bring our personal lives into the office, that is an inappropriate thing to do. And what's happened is there's been a big mindset shift over the last 15 years. And much of that is because we've got, new generations coming into the workplace, and things that were for us not appropriate are completely expected now. And so it's hard for some people for whom personal privacy is a big thing, to adjust to that. So, authenticity is something that we all hear about. And I tell people, look, no one's expecting you to spill the beans about your personal life. But I think that people really want to see who you are. What are your values and what's important? Most leaders really care about their people, unless they're jerks, right? And we have some of those leaders out there, and we're not going to be able to do anything in terms of changing those people at this time. One of the things, and I know the group that I talk to a lot, we've all agreed that what happens in a time of crisis, and especially in COVID, is the great leaders are even better, and the bad leaders, the light is on them. And that's a big issue. The big spotlight shone on the people who have not been great leaders. So organizations have to decide what they're going to do about those people. But I think that everybody has the ability to be authentic, and you can start with a small thing. And I tell people, when you're building trust in a relationship and you're shifting like this, somebody's got to go first. So when you're trying to build trust, one of us has to take a chance. We have to share something. And really, it's up to the leader to step out and take that first risk. Because when you share something, you've basically signaled to the team what the new normal will be for you. So that if you share something simple like, wow, I'm really finding, it frustrating and hard to be separated from people like this. It's hard to not be with the team, or it's hard not to see you every day. How are all of you guys finding it? Or, hey, I'm finding it difficult if you've got kids to juggle my kids. I'm just not finding that easy to do. What about you? Hey, Romina.
Hi. I was listening to a few of the comments, and I think it's really important also for leaders to really understand or remove, leaders and employees both and teams, to really remove any biases as well. Because when you're on camera, and like you talked about earlier, seeing people in their personal space, there are some people who have really messy backgrounds, and there are some that have very neat backgrounds. And so it sometimes puts biases in place in terms of even financial well-being or not, or whether this person's really organized or not. And so I think it's really important to move that, because if I took you down to my basement, you might think, oh my goodness, like what's happening? There's a tornado here. But if I took you to my living room, you might think something very different. So it really depends. And I think people need to be cognizant of that.
I think that's a great point. You know, we were talking on one of my other groups yesterday about ageism. And this is the time, you know, we talk about subconscious bias, right? And we all have it. We all have it about different things. You bring up such a good point, Romina, because we have to really suspend judgment right now, because we don't know people's circumstances, and we have to be really careful to not read too much into what we see. I personally love to see people's backgrounds because it just tells me about them, not in a negative, not in a judgmental way, but and I comment on it. So sometimes I'll see people's books, or there'll be books, but they're all disorganized, and I'll say, wow, it looks like you really love reading and you love books. Or you see somebody's kids, you know, or you see art or something. It's so, as a leader, you know, you can kind of connect with your people by taking a personal piece like that and commenting on it. So to Ingrid's point, you can kind of break the ice. And also to not be too judgmental if people's environments aren't totally controlled, right? So I was watching actually quite a professional global interview with a very well-known person whose dog started going crazy in the background, right? So I mean, it doesn't just happen in these little Zoom videos. It happens in big interviews. And I think that's fine. Like, that's life. Yeah, Shelley.
Kim, you wanted to say something?
Shelley.
Oh, I just have
Sorry.
to,
Sorry.
that's okay. The other thing that I think that this does is it puts you on equal ground. So there's like when you're on these meetings, or even, you know, in terms of leadership, you know, I think right now, one of the things about COVID is it's even the playing field. We're all going through the same thing, no matter what level or what position or what social economic category we're in. We're all level. And I think that as a leader, showing some of your vulnerability to anyone that you're dealing with, I think it adds some credibility too. And I think that it's interesting times because we are all at that, you know, that level playing field. We're all dealing with the same things. So it's an interesting, and just going back to the background. I mean, I have nothing on my walls because I painted right before this, but I had an interview this week, and you know, the person that was interviewing me, in her background, now she wasn't interviewing, but in a way I was interviewing her too, but it was a mess. She had her shoe closet, you know. And I'm like, okay, obviously that took like she didn't look at what was behind her or whatever. So it is interesting, and it's a whole other world. That's definite. So anyway, that's all.
If I could just say, you made a very good point. Like, I admit for myself, I have a bit of fear showing my vulnerability sometimes. I have a fear about it. You know, is my having a bad hair day? Look, I just have a green screen. I don't want you to see my apartment. You know, like I guess I have the fear, like, how will I be judged? You know, and I guess social media today, you do one wrong thing, and is it going to go on social media? Someone's going to talk about it. You know, I have those fears and those hesitations. Does anybody feel like I feel? I do. I just turned off my background, by the way. Just I heard that. But like, just simple thing like, do I wear a jacket? Do I wear a shirt and tie? Do I wear a shirt? I don't know. You know, like, this is learn as you go. But you're right about the vulnerability, and you know, I feel vulnerable putting myself on camera all the time. Does anybody feel like that? Does anybody have a vulnerability? What's the word I want to use? A fear of vulnerability. Is that the right word? Or
Fear of exposure.
I have it. You know what I mean? But like, does anybody else feel like that? Or
We have a few hands, Bruce.
what?
We have a few hands.
I'll make a comment. It's Greg. I think the fear might be related also to our age, because millennials, like I have teenage kids, they are on FaceTime video like 24/7. I think they are incredibly comfortable, and the amount of recording they do for TikToks, you know, everyone has seen kids today, and I think that generation is going to be very, very, very used to being on video, showing themselves, talking to people, because they do it all the time. And I find this conversation's interesting, and I'm wondering if people feel the same way. We've had video conferencing in business now for 10 to 15 years. And most of us have probably managed remote teams where you're talking to people in Calgary, Vancouver, Los Angeles, maybe even different places of the planet. So is it really just COVID now where we're sort of experiencing a pandemic and we're trying to adapt? Because everyone's probably had conversations and video calls before, and we've had staff that has been remote. So what is it so different now? Is it really just the people being worried, like I guess they're trying to manage their home and working from home. And secondly, people are shit scared about, pardon my language, about the pandemic.
Right.
Yeah.
Bruce, we have a couple of Kim and Ann and.
Okay, Kim's put up her hand a couple of times. Hi, Kim.
Hi.
Why don't you tell us about yourself? Tell us about yourself a bit.
Oh, I'm so boring. I've been in HR my whole career. I'm in transition. I'm doing a bunch of job interviews, and no, I don't interview in the backyard, but so oh my gosh, I'm hearing so many interesting things I'm trying to pull together.
Yeah.
And I'm thinking about what Greg just said about the kids, and I think he's 100% right. The kids will do better at this than us 50 pluses. But I actually really like Zoom. I haven't got tired of it. And I think I like it because it gives me the chance to project myself to, I think we have 26 people on this call, to 26 people that I would lose all of this dynamic if we were on the phone. And then I'm also thinking about Greg's comment about, okay, we've all had video conferencing and meetings. Yeah, but those were structured and formal, and I had my role and you had your role, and we would answer questions back and forth. This is organic, guys. This is, as we all said, sitting at home with our bookcases or our cedar trees behind.
Whoops.
Whatever.
Kim there.
This is much more real. It's much more intimate.
It is. That's so true. That's so true. Thank you for sharing.
Ann was there.
Sorry,
So,
Ann.
hi, everyone. I agree with all the comments, and I agree with Kim and you, Deb, in that this is a very interesting way, and I'm not tired of Zoom either. I'm on it a lot during the day, and I love for a lack of term, the eyeball to eyeball interaction with people, where, you know, if we didn't have Zoom, we wouldn't be seeing anybody today because of COVID. And this is a way of just building relationships and being with people. But on the other thing, I think today for leaders are trying to build soft skills that they haven't had to build when they've been in an office environment and seen people face to face. And one of the skills I know leaders need to build today is empathy, because without empathy, there's no trust. Without trust, there's no empathy. And so I think it's important, more so now for HR than ever before, that we do the senior development and make sure that senior leaders understand that it's not just about, that there's more to them being a leader than bossing people around, for lack of better. But there's more to being a leader, and it is about the interaction with people and showing that you have a vulnerable side and showing that you're human. And that's really important, and I think difficult for some leaders now to bring out.
But how, you mentioned something, just asked a question about empathy. How do you build empathy online? How do you improve that?
Yes, so what I talk to leaders right now about learning to ask really good questions. So during this time, it's very important for you to listen really well and to ask questions because, again, when you're in a room together, some of that comes a lot more readily, but in this environment, you have to state your intentions quite clearly. So what's also different now is you have to be very clear about your expectations, because you don't necessarily have that ability to run down the hall and say, hey, one question, or your team doesn't have the ability to pop by your office and say to you, oh, I'm just working on this piece. Can you just clarify? Again, they have to call you or email you or book a time. You have to either get on the phone or get onto Zoom. So again, everything is much more intentional. So I think what's important for leaders is to be super clear about their expectations and also to manage your expectations. So what I've talked about to leaders who are onboarding and to their bosses is you have to be very realistic about what you expect somebody to achieve in this kind of environment. Especially anybody who's got kids or who's got elderly parents. I mean, people are super distracted right now. So, and they may not be able to work the typical, if you're a leader, have an expectation where your staff sits down at 9, takes their lunch, leaves at 5. That's not the way we're working. One of the issues we're hearing about is the bleeding of boundaries, right? We're all suffering from that, where I'm used to working from home. I only go into the office 1 day a week. But even for me, who's used to working from home, I was like working all the time, right? Because there's nowhere else, there's no way to mark your day. There's no way to mark the beginning of your day, the end of the day, because there's nowhere to go. You can't go to a cafe, you can't go out for a dinner. So you're all just hanging around and you just keep on working. So you have to help yourself and your team understand those boundaries, and you have to manage your expectations and communicate those expectations really clearly, because people aren't certain. And as leaders, because we're all working all the time, you may be sending emails in the evening or late at night, all kinds of times. And your staff won't really know whether you expect them to reply to that email when they receive it. So what I've started doing with my assistant is in the subject line, I will say, you can respond to this tomorrow, but it happens to be 10. I happen to have this on my mind. I want to get it off my plate. So I put it in the email, but I tell her very specifically, I don't expect a response. So I think that's really important, because we're all working weird hours, and your team doesn't understand what they're supposed to do, and they want to please you and they want to deliver for you. So the clearer you can be on expectations, even if you have to have that conversation, because they're not going to tell you. They may not feel comfortable with saying, I'm looking at Greg because you're going like this, hey Gregory, I wish they would say to you, did you really expect me to respond to that at 10? Because what if you said yes? Then they're going to think that you think they're not willing. So they're just going to do it and they'll grumble. So, or be stressed. So I think that, I always like to be clear with people. I don't expect a response, or expect a response in 3 days. But even around work delivery, set up realistic expectations and really try to open up give them permission to tell you if they're struggling. Because I know there are a lot of people struggling right now. Yes, I'll just take, I don't know, you don't have a name there, person in the white. I've just run a series of leadership groups for very senior female leaders in an organization. Very powerful women, by the way. And I asked them, what is your major feeling during COVID? And they talked about fear, because they're afraid to speak up, to talk about the struggles with juggling their kids and their parents and their workloads, because they don't want their bosses to think they're not capable. And if you knew these women, you would think that that's the most crazy thing. These are incredibly successful women. So I'm just trying to communicate with you bosses that this is going on top of your employees' minds.
So I got a question. So what are those elephants in the room? What are the elephants? Like, like, do you?
Lady here, I don't know her name because she doesn't have a name on her screen in the white, had a comment. Oh, Stephanie. Oh, there, Stephanie.
I don't know why I wasn't showing up. It was showing up on my screen.
Now it is.
There's a couple of themes that are coming through, and I've had the luxury of managing teams over. It started with Skype, and then it went to Slack, and then it went to Teams, and now it's on Zoom a lot of the time. And not necessarily in Zoom, but definitely on Slack and Teams. The ability to get across the expectation is easier because you've got the chat that you can direct to them as well. So you can understand sort of from a thread that's coming when you need to pick up and go online and actually see them and see what they're feeling, because the communication that you've got with your team members, you can see the subtleties in the change in the chat and can pick up on the things as if you were in the office. The other aspect to it too, as well, though, is that Zoom ends up being just as if you had your door closed in the office. And as when we realize that, okay, you know what? Because they actually have to physically do something, go knock on your door or go pick up the phone or go pick up the Zoom, that if you start to notice those subtleties by you initiating and going to them, it gets that connection going a little bit faster. Especially, well, I was dealing with different languages as well, and you can really pick it up in the threads in the different languages and know that you've got to pick it up at a certain point, because otherwise the empathy and connection doesn't come there, and then the expectations also go completely astray.
Yeah, that's such good points. And by the way, you know, some of you may think that at this point it's easier just to do a lot of email communication. I can't tell you how many times I've been called in as a coach to intervene between team members who are having raging battles that they can't resolve and their bosses can't resolve. And you know where it starts? It starts with an email that somebody took the wrong way, and then somebody responded to it. And I'm telling you, 2 email later, this situation between people who have typically gotten along spins so out of control that they actually have to bring me in to mediate the conflict. So don't be tempted because it feels so deliberate to have to ask for a face-to-face on Zoom. Email should only communicate instructional things like, please do this, or what's your status on that. But anything that can be interpreted, or anything that contains feelings, or if you're being critical, like just don't do it by email. People read a lot of stuff into email that's not there. Why did he use that word versus that word? What do you think he meant? And then they're going to ask people, and then it becomes all through the office, and it becomes a whole thing. So resist that temptation, because Zoom takes time. You have to schedule it, but it's really worth it because you'll pay for it the other end.
So how
Deborah, can I? Oh, sorry.
No,
Kim.
Deborah, I wanted to speak to something that you raised a moment ago, and it was around we're all working at crazy hours, and sometimes you just do your thought dump, but now you've thrown a monkey on someone else's back. So about 2 years ago, I led from the HR perspective a 4-way merger. And you can imagine that was hell on wheels for about 18 months. Everybody was working 24/7. And we implemented something that I strongly recommend if you're finding in your life that that's what's happening. I got our CEO to issue something from the top, and that was emails or calls will cease at, pick your time, 7 to 7, I don't know, whatever. And if you've got to get something off your brain, get it off your brain, but put a timed delivery on it so it doesn't show up to the next person, to the person's next day email box. Now, why that worked for 1,100 employees, half of which were office workers, was because it came from the top and it gave you permission. It meant it's okay to have dinner with your kids and walk your dog. You don't have to check your email at 6, 7, 8, 9. I don't know if that can work in this circumstance, but I'll tell you, it saved a lot of working relationships in my experience.
I think, Kim, it's Tamara. That's a great idea. I think the challenge is when you work in a global company, it's just simply not possible if you're working with people around the world. I really just wanted to comment on something Deborah said. I think it's excellent, Deborah, to set expectations about not working after hours. One of the things I would say is if you are the kind of person who are working odd hours and you choose to do that, you might also do what Kim said, which is in Outlook, you can set it to deliver in the morning. So I definitely had a manager who worked for me, and she worked at home 100% of the time, whereas everybody else was in and out, and we were in Toronto, so you're commuting. So she had kind of all that extra commute time, and she chose to work odd hours. And even though she would say to people, I don't expect you to respond, she would email them in the middle of the night, Saturdays and Sundays. And so even if you say you're not responding, you're setting an expectation that's how you as the leader work. So definitely we did encourage her to start sending it to her employees so that it would deliver first thing in the morning as opposed to the middle of the night, to stop setting those expectations. And I completely agree with Kim. I just know that we had a lot of trouble in a global organization. It just simply wasn't possible because the after 7 is when Asia is awake.
Right. You set that up in the role. So people, that's a different issue, right? Because people accepted that as what is going on there.
Right.
Anne and Gregory.
Thanks. So the other thing that COVID, I think, has done for a lot of organizations is it's changed the definition of the workday. And the workday is no longer 9 to 5 because people are at home with kids and have to look after kids and homeschool kids, and whatever their reasons are, they're spending more time with their kids during the day and going back onto the computer after the kids are in bed to complete their work. I think that means that, yes, they can delay the delivery of emails till the morning, even if they're working at 10 o'clock at night. And I think they should, because the expectation, people have just an innate sense that if they receive an email that it's important and they need to respond to it, unless you tell them they don't have to. But if they don't receive it till 7 or 8 o'clock, then they can respond to it when they get it. I think that's important. So the definition of the workday has changed. I believe, and I think it will continue this way for a very long time, as people continue to work from home and have personal expectations that they need to complete when they're at home.
Yeah, I agree. So that's why we have to be clear about the boundaries, right? And it comes from the leader of that team. Gregory, I'm so interested in your perspective.
Thank you. One of the things that I was going to contribute was I totally agree with your approach, Deborah, in that making it clear what the expectations are if you send an email at 10 o'clock at night, I think is key. But I would go a step farther than that and sit down if you're in a meeting, and maybe an icebreaker is something that could revolve around what makes people uncomfortable dealing in this new reality, because we're all in it together. I know, people have kids as an example, and so consequently they understand that, they can't always be available, but maybe not everybody else understands. So let's get that on the table and figure out how best to deal with that. In terms of when you respond, I know I have clients who deal with Seoul, Korea all the time. They're in the cosmetics business. And Seoul happens to be exactly the opposite time we are. So if it's 6 o'clock in the evening here, it's 6 o'clock in the morning there. To not respond until 9 a.m. the next morning, because those are our business hours, means that you delay the cycle of getting a response by 24 hours. That's not acceptable. So people, in that business do understand that, it may be necessary to do an email or two in the evening, especially if they're going to Korea. So we sit and talk about that and figure out how we might best make that work. it's a great icebreaker. It certainly shows empathy as the manager or the leader of the group, that you understand what people are going through, and people need to know that you understand that and that you do care. So, rather than sit and talk about the kids or those kinds of things, I think this is a great icebreaker around how to conduct a meeting. So that's really all I needed to say. Thanks.
You know what I'd like to add to that, Gregory, because I think it's such a great point, is if you go around the table and ask people what they're not comfortable with, or you ask people what they're dealing with or where they're struggling. If all you do is take in the information and acknowledge it and do nothing to help them, you may as well not have bothered to ask the question. And I've heard that where there are leaders who have learned in leadership school that you've got to check in, you've got to ask how people are. So the leader, we talk about the script so they know they have to do that, but then nothing happens. And so what happens is employees then get really cynical, saying, well, they don't really care. They're just asking because someone told them that this is what they should do. So I think what's really important is you got to follow through. If you're not prepared to hear it and respond to it, don't even ask. Right.
Well, totally agree with you. Follow through is absolutely everything. But I think it's important when you're having these meetings to to recognize that these are employees. They're not necessarily your neighbor or your friends. They're people that are on the other side of the city or possibly the other side of the world even. And so to keep the conversation around things that are relevant to the relationship in this business, I think is important. So understanding what some of the challenges are that people are finding themselves facing is extremely important, and then offering up some suggestions, or throwing it open to the group. How do you folks feel that this might best be handled? And generally, if you get a good dialogue going, out of that will come some fantastic ideas. So you don't have to be the person that has all the solutions, but I do think it's important that you provide the environment in which people are comfortable talking about these things, so that we can resolve some of these things. What do I do if I get an email at 10 o'clock at night? I have other things I'm doing at 10 o'clock at night, and I'm not comfortable dealing with that. If it doesn't get dealt with, it is going to fester. So I think you need to make it incredibly clear what the expectations are in this new environment. Otherwise, people are going to be uncomfortable, and you need to arrive at some joint consensus around how we are going to conduct ourselves, so that everybody knows what works. I had a conversation last night, as an example, at 10 o'clock at night over a business issue. I didn't mind. I was available. I could have ignored the the response, but I didn't, because I was available to deal with it. Not everybody may be. So I think it's incredibly important to to have that understanding with the group of people that are in your circle, so that whether it's okay to call somebody at 10 o'clock at night, as an example.
Question. How do you?
So good.
Sorry, Shelley.
Yeah. Thank you. I agree with you, but I think that things have changed a long time ago in terms of expectations and your flexibility in terms of getting back to people. I think ever since companies have provided their leaders or a lot of their employees with cell phones, that people felt that the expectation was to get back to people at any time of the day. And really, I think that that laying out those expectations are very, very key, because it really is not necessary, and yet those expectations sometimes are a bit gray. And I think that this has just opened it up even more because of working from home. So there's no start to the date, end to the day. And I mean, even we could go as far as even vacations. People aren't taking those vacations either. Everything is so gray. So I think the expectations in terms of availability has changed a long time before this. but they definitely need to be laid out. And I think that the communication of that is so key.
What a great conversation to have with your group, Shelley. I totally agree with you. I think it did start well before COVID, but it has been amplified, if you will, by COVID. So it is a good conversation to have, and I think it's something that would be on 90% of the people around the table's minds, and it is important to get people comfortable with how they wish to be dealt with, and what your needs are as well, and find a way that both of those things can happen, so that people aren't constantly feeling stressed out because they don't have any personal time in their lives anymore.
One point I'd like to make, because I deal with this a lot in coaching executives, I think it's really important for leaders to look internally at their own drivers. So I think that unless the leaders are willing to examine their own motivations, why, especially if you're a high achiever who has big expectations put upon ourselves, and then rely on the people around us to help us meet our own goals, the kind of pressure that's pushed down on your team is immense. And I think that there are leaders out there who feel that they can call you any time of day or night, because that's how they work. And because they have an agenda that is very, very ambitious, they expect you to share that same agenda. And sometimes they're not willing to accept that people have different expectations, different professional or personal goals, and because they don't match yours doesn't make them bad employees. And sometimes you need to look at, why are you driving so hard? How much of this is about them and how much of it is about you? And I have to spend a lot of time with executives, getting them to look at some of their own assumptions about what success looks like for them, and for their lives, and what's driving them. So I think that leaders also have to be very self-aware. And when people aren't self-aware, then they kind of transfer what they're about onto the people around them. And they get very frustrated if people don't play ball with what it is they're trying to do.
Kind of brings us back to Greg's comment earlier, what can I learn from my kids? Because there is a lot to learn, and I think kids have a particularly good way, I guess, of making their thoughts around their own personal space and time known. Another point I would bring forward is, as a leader, I always try to sit back and understand, is the reason for my demand at 10 o'clock at night driven by the fact that I could be a type A personality with an enormously large ego, or is it driven by business? Because if it isn't driven by a real business need, I should be recognizing that this can wait until tomorrow, and that an employee who is stressed out and tired and frustrated is absolutely of zero use to me in the tomorrows or the day afters, if they aren't having time to recharge. So I think as leaders, we need to sit back and ask, how much of this are we creating and how much of this is being driven by the business, and that, I think, provides some great guidance as well.
Can I just ask a question? Sorry.
I should say, Greg, I think you're probably a very good leader, because you obviously have those qualities of self-reflection and empathy, and I think that's so important.
That's good. But Greg and everybody, is the definition of a leader today changing? Like, we're thinking leaders as owners of companies and maybe the top end managers. Is it because of technology, because of COVID? Is a frontline worker, can anybody take the position of leader? What is the definition of a leader? Like, I think if you just take a leader, I don't think it's I think it may be, is it shifting? Like, can't we all be leaders? Given technology, what is? What
The
is really a leader today?
tools are shifting,
But-
Bruce, but I
Yeah.
don't think that the principles of leadership have really
Okay.
shifted. I think that, we struggle. I know I struggle as an example with something Deb started the conversation with around how do you check in with someone and, when are you micromanaging versus allowing the person the freedom to grow and to get the job done on their own. When you see them face to face every day, you can tell whether things are okay or whether they're not okay. You can't when you're at a distance, unless you do call or, do a Zoom video such as we are. But how often is too often? And I know that's something I struggle with because I have not yet figured out what the signal is that I need to make a call to somebody, unless of course a deadline passes. But then it's too late. So it's basically management by walking around, except I can't walk around anymore. And so I'm struggling with that one myself, but this conversation today has given me a couple of new thoughts around what's important and what we should be talking about. It's made me think about them. I probably already knew them. I just hadn't thought of them. So it's brought it from somewhere in the back of my mind to the forefront of my mind, and I hope that will help me a little bit with being a little more comfortable around when to call and what to say when I do or what to talk about.
But what about things like feedback? Like, how do you really gauge people? Because what you may think may not be, because people's perception is their reality. Like, how do you know how you're perceived? Sometimes you might be thinking, like, is there a way to check, or do you ask people, like how do you, again, I guess maybe does it get back to vulnerability? Like how do you know how you're perceived, or do you have to check in on, how do you
I know some companies that I have worked at have done what they call a 360-degree surround view, where you would send out a questionnaire to the people that you work with and ask them to provide feedback to you. Sometimes it's anonymous, sometimes it's not. But it gives you some feedback around, how people, feel their working relationship is with you. It's scary because you don't know what you're going to get back. It's scary because, just as you said, when you post things on social media, if you don't do it right, something could go viral and not in a good way. So, you have to take a deep breath. But if you want to know the answer to that, I think, the answer is probably similar to what it was when we were all face to face.
Stephanie?
So this is one where it sounds like really simple. And if you have that connection with somebody, leave yourself open for the feedback and ask for it. You'd be surprised how many times people will actually give it to you. And one of the things, particularly with remote teams, ask the people that's part of your team, but ask somebody who's sitting in the office that's a peer as well, because they get a good sense of the temperature in the room. And I know that we can't actually get that right now, but sometimes that person that's your peer in the office or in that particular organization is getting feedback that you're not getting. And you have to be open to ask. But what you do when you do that is you open up the empathy and you open up the connection as well.
Interesting.
Yeah, and I think I think Stephanie and Greg made the excellent point that you have to allow people and tell people that you actually want to hear the feedback. And then again, the follow through, because once you hear the feedback, you actually have to have an action. So you have to respond to it and say, well, thank you for that feedback. Here's what I'm going to do. And by the way, I'll need your help in doing it, because often it's about changing our behavior, which it becomes habituated, right? So sometimes we're not aware of what we're doing. We're not able to change it that easily. So we have to ask whoever gave us that feedback to help us in our journey of changing that, and to be willing to partner with us on that. But you have to be willing then to put yourself out there, because that's a scary place to be, right? Because you're the in control leader, and here's the ultimate vulnerability.
We're coming very close, by the way, to the end of the session. We're at 10:59 right now. And I'm encouraging anybody, does anybody want to ask a question who hasn't spoke up? that they'd like to speak up. And I'm curious, I guess, I don't know, like, I guess it's a challenge for people. Like, I'd love to hear from someone who, when people don't speak up in the meeting, is there a challenge for some people, or is it the elephant in the room? I'm just curious why people, like, some people speak up, some people don't. I'm just kind of curious, maybe just people the way they are. You know what I mean? They're like, Deborah, just the way they are. I'm just curious. I'm learning from this meeting today, and I appreciate it.
Well, I think what's fun, I've been running my own sessions since the beginning of COVID, and it's very funny. I always wonder, the quiet people, and some of them just say, oh, I just want to listen. But I think it's the vulnerability piece that it takes us time to speak up. Sometimes we feel like, maybe people won't appreciate what we have to say. And the reality is that I think people should always go. I'm a big believer in stepping a little bit out of your comfort zone, a little bit at a time, because I think that you have to start somewhere. These Zoom meetings are a great way to do it.
Wonderful. Anyways, I want to thank everybody. Thank you, Deborah. Thank you, everybody, for attending. Thank you, everyone, for participating. Thank you for your contribution. And it was a wonderful session. And thank you. And very insightful. And have a wonderful day.
The music.
Yeah, take care. Bye-bye, everybody. Bye-bye. Bye-bye. Enjoy. Bye-bye. Thank you.
Bruce, thanks for putting this together. Sorry, my phone went off there, but I just wanted to say thanks for putting this together. I think it was a great session this morning. And Deborah, if you're still there, thank you for, being brave enough to kick it off and get us going. I'm not sure that it would have happened if we didn't have you to kick it off and Bruce to organize it in the first place. So
well, I want to give credit. Most of the work is actually done by Christina, my marketing manager. Behind the scenes, you don't see her, but she's actually behind the scenes doing all the work. I guess we just have the vision, and I just want to give her credit to do. All this stuff you see, 80% is, or 90% is actually done by Christina. So I want to give credit where credit's due.
Yeah,
and I appreciate her, and thank you so much.
Thanks for that music, Greg. I thought it was Bruce's sign-off music.
No, that was what I like.
Right,
actually, we should do that.
Anyway.
I like that. We're going to do a next webinar. Take care, guys.
Thanks.
Bye-bye. Bye.